This is K.M. Weiland, and you are listening to the 425th episode of the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. Final content edits are finished on my superhero historical Wayfarer, which means I'm diving into proofreading now. I've talked before about my secret weapon for catching typos, but it works so fantastically that it's worth mentioning again. I find that I'm able to catch 99% of my typos by loading my manuscript on my Kindle, having it read aloud to me, and reading along with it. I'm not sure if this feature is available on more recent generations. I use an old touchpad Kindle with the read aloud feature. But you can also get Adobe Reader to read aloud. It's perfect for making sure you pay attention to each word that's there instead of what your brain wants to trick you into thinking is there. It's also a great way to check every line in the formatted ebook version of the book. And now I hope you enjoyed this week's podcast. What should your character talk about? Dialogue is the best part of stories. Yes, even better than Dickensian narratorial diatribes about crooked politics. But it's tough to write scintillating dialogue when you find yourself asking that fundamental question, what should my characters talk about? As writers, we're familiar with the rant about show, don't tell. We're supposed to bring our stories to life so vividly, readers can see it all happening and forget they're being told a story. But the truth is, all our best efforts at showing are really just a magic trick. Written fiction is always and inevitably about us telling our readers a story, with one exception. And brownie points for you if you already know that exception is dialogue. Dialogue is the one aspect of story you can share with readers without needing to describe, embellish, or otherwise bring it to life. All you have to do is record exactly what your characters say and let their words speak for themselves. But first, your characters need something to talk about, right? And it's got to be good, like Spencer Tracy, Katharine Hepburn, good. More than that, it's got to be good, and it's got to move the plot in meaningful ways. No pressure, right? A few weeks ago, Jamie left a comment talking about this common dilemma among writers and offering some excellent advice of her own. She says, I had a colleague ask me once about dialogue, as in the characters having something to say to each other. Not even making dialogue witty or full of subtext, but just talking to each other, period. For me, the idea is that characters should have something to say to each other, or there's something wrong. There should be an immediate purpose. Hey, want to get a pizza? And a larger purpose, for example, strategizing how to thwart an upcoming heist while they eat the pizza. Dialogue should reveal something of the characters, as in maybe one character always orders something different on her pizza, and the other one has a specific topping combination named for her because she only ever orders that one. I think I advised her to consider her plot and themes on the grounds that dialogue may flow from there. I don't know if you've ever addressed dialogue from the angle of what do they say when they're talking, but I've seen a few other writers struggle with that question. I suspect it would be a breakthrough if they could crack that particular element. So to that end, let's take a look at what meaningful dialogue looks like and how you can find answers to what should your characters talk about on every single page. Now, dialogue manifests in several different ways, all of which are perfectly legit. Here are three. Number one, conversation in a scene that is action-oriented. First off, and most obvious, is dialogue that occurs in the action half of scene structure, the scene portion which focuses on goal, conflict, and disaster. These are the scenes in which your POV character wants something. She has a goal, and it's very likely she's going to need to talk to someone else along the way because either she needs information, which is a goal in itself, or another character is creating conflict by verbally and or physically blocking her ability to reach that goal, or she's voicing emotions about the goal. Number two, conversations in a sequel, which is reaction-oriented. After the action-focused scene portion comes the sequel, in which characters react to their thwarted or semi-thwarted goal in the previous section and figure out what to do about it via reaction, dilemma, and decision. These scenes are often the talkiest of the entire story. This is where a lot of great character reflection and development can happen, and where characters can share interesting facts about each other, insofar as those facts are pertinent to the conflict. These conversations aren't usually as focused as the dialogue in scenes, but they offer the opportunity to deep dive into character motivations. And number 3, standalone dialogue. Not all dialogue will be part of an in-depth exchange. Throughout your story, you'll also need standalone or throwaway lines of dialogue that serve any number of purposes, including sharing information, creating verisimilitude via background noise, and offering catalysts for your narrating characters' goals and reactions. So, with that in mind, what should your characters talk about? In a nutshell, a story is sharing of information. And this is just as true of dialogue as any other device used to tell that story. This means that whatever your characters are talking about should be designed to share information of one sort or another in one way or another. Although dialogue should never be used to info dump information, especially via the clumsy, as you know, Bob, crutch, it is actually one of the best ways to share info. This only works, however, when what you're sharing moves the plot. Done skillfully, the very sharing between characters becomes a plot movement in itself. Now, there are 3 types of information you might share in your dialogue. These include, number 1, your characters can talk about world building. Story is a give and take between characters and the world they live in. The things your character knows about the setting and the things he does not will always be pertinent. Many setting facts will be shared in narrative, but the most interesting and important can be shared in dialogue. This is especially true in the beginning of the story, when readers are being introduced to the setting, the rules that govern it, and the specific problems it is presenting the protagonist. Number 2. Your characters can talk about themselves. Most people like to talk about themselves. Same goes for characters. And if they don't like to talk about themselves, why, so much more the delicious, since other interested characters get to pry out the details. But the tricky key here is that, as with all dialogue, the character information can't be just random info. Your protagonist had a treehouse when she was 8, loves red licorice, and can't stand penny loafers. So what? Taken at face value, none of these facts are particularly interesting, and out of context certainly don't seem likely to move the plot. But if she hid in the treehouse when her scary uncle came to visit, associates red licorice with her best friend's funeral, and resents loafers because her lazy first boyfriend wore them, now you have something worth exploring in dialogue, especially if these details and another character's learning of them via dialogue will advance the plot. And number 3, your characters can talk about the plot. Your characters don't live in a vacuum. They live in a plot. So when in doubt about an appropriate subject for them to discuss, take a look at that delightful little humdinger of a plot you've got going on. Your protag's a detective trying to solve a mystery. He can talk about that. She's a single mom trying to keep her kid out of trouble. Tons of conversation fodder right there. He's a soldier trying to overcome PTSD. Sounds juicy to me. The best way to write dialogue is to start with a focus. What does this conversation need to accomplish in the story? And then just loose the characters' wagging tongues. Writing fast and furious dialogue is not just fun, it's also a great way to come up with some gems. But once you've got all those quote marks littering your page, how do you know if what your characters are saying is actually important enough to keep? So here are 5 questions to ask about every dialogue exchange. Question number 1, does it have a point? And this is a big one. Are these characters talking just to fill space because they're bored and have nothing better to do, and because you're bored and didn't know what else to write? Or is there a reason they're talking? Does one, or preferably both, of the characters involved in this conversation have a goal? The goal doesn't always have to be explicit. For example, the detective wants to know where his suspect was on the night of the murder, so he says, "Tell me where you were on the night of the 15th. Sometimes, though, it can be implicit subtext buried beneath what is otherwise meaningless nothings. The single mom is worried about her kid, but doesn't want to smother him, so she says, "Did you see that cute cat video?" Question number 2. Does it move the plot? Like all scenes, dialogue can't exist in a vacuum. If the story remains unchanged at the end of any conversation, then it's probably extraneous. Change is the only way to know if your plot is progressing. If that "Hi, how are you?" across the fence with the neighbor adds no new information that prompts a new action or conversation from your character, then it's not moving the plot. And this is where conflict plays a vital role. Dialogue exchanges between characters with opposing goals can be a fabulous way of presenting obstacles and thus conflict. Question number 3. Does it share important information? Whether or not a piece of information is important is entirely contextual. My favorite color is fuchsia could be incredibly boring nonsense, or that one clue upon which the whole story pivots. So here's a rule of thumb. Even the most boring and seemingly surface bits of dialogue should have deeper meaning. If you need a character to be momentarily distracted on the subway by a walk-on character, then try your best to make even that tiny exchange have at least a thematic purpose. Nothing in your story should ever be throwaway, including the dialogue. Question number 4. Does it share something interesting? And now, I'm sorry to say, I'm about to complicate everything. It's not enough for dialogue to ace all the above by being pointed and purposeful and the natural outgrowth of your character's super important goal. It's also got to be interesting. This is the single greatest factor separating bad dialogue from good dialogue and good dialogue from masterful dialogue. Is what your characters are talking about interesting? Is it entertaining? If readers opened your book to this conversation, would they want to read it even though they have no idea what's happening in the story's larger context? And question number 5, what are the characters' motives? If you find you're struggling with any of the above, take a step back. Dialogue is a surface interaction. It is an external manifestation of the character's deeper workings. In other words, dialogue never just pops out of nowhere. It is always motivated by something. This is particularly important when creating wonderful subtextual dialogue in which the words of the conversation actually have nothing to do with what is really being said. Take a look at each speaker's motive for pursuing this conversation. What does each person really want in this scene? Character is story. Story is character. Dialogue is a tool to represent both in an entertaining and accessible way. The next time you find yourself asking, what should your characters talk about? Figure out what topic would best serve the advancement of the plot and the development of the characters, and then let those quote marks fly. Thank you for listening to the Wordplay Podcast. To read a transcript of this episode, you can visit my website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. And be sure to check back again next week.